Welcome to the Black Gods podcast. Today we're talking about spirituality, control, and why certain practices were demonized while others were accepted. This conversation is about awareness. It's about understanding how fear, misinformation, and power have shaped how people view spirituality, especially within the Black community. A lot of people don't realize that spirituality has always been diverse, layered, and interconnected. Long before organized religion as we know it today, people across different parts of the world, especially in Africa, were practicing spiritual systems rooted in nature, ancestors, community, and direct connection to the divine. These systems were not just about worship, they were about healing, they were about guidance, they were about protection. They were about understanding life, the elements, and the unseen forces that shape our reality. Now, when you look at history, especially during slavery, you start to see how control played a major role in how spirituality was presented to Black people. Enslaved Africans were stripped of their languages, their names, their traditions, and their spiritual systems. And one of the most effective ways to control a group of people is to control what they believe, especially what they fear. Because if you can make someone afraid of their own roots, you disconnect them from their power. Practices like hoodoo and vodou were not originally seen as evil by the people who practiced them. They were systems of survival, healing, and resistance. These practices were used to maintain connection to ancestors, to find strength, and in some cases to resist oppression in whatever ways people could. That's important context. But from the perspective of those in power at the time, anything that gave enslaved people a sense of unity, identity, or empowerment could be seen as a threat. So narratives were created, stories were spread, fear was introduced, and over time, those practices were labeled as dark, dangerous, or forbidden. That's how propaganda works. It doesn't always remove something completely. Sometimes it distorts it so much that people turn away from it on their own. It creates fear where there was once familiarity. It creates shame where there was once pride. And when that happens, people begin to police themselves. They begin to reject parts of themselves without even realizing why. Now, at the same time, many enslaved Africans were introduced to Christianity, and within that experience, something interesting happened. People didn't just abandon their ways, they adapted, they interpreted, they found meaning in new frameworks while still holding on to pieces of what they knew, because spirituality at its core is about connection. You'll notice that across different traditions, whether it's African spiritual systems, Christianity, or others, there are similarities: use of water for cleansing, oils for anointing, incense for purification, prayer, reverence for higher guidance. These are not random. These are human ways of connecting to something greater. But how those practices are framed and who gets to define them matters. When one system is presented as holy and another as evil, even when they share similar elements, that's when you have to start asking deeper questions. Not to reject everything, but to understand everything, because misinformation doesn't always come as a full lie. Sometimes it comes as a half truth, something that sounds right on the surface, but is incomplete, something that leaves out context. And over time, those half truths shape perception, they shape identity, they shape how people see themselves and where they believe they belong. Fear has always been a powerful tool. If you can make people afraid of something, you don't have to control them directly. They will control themselves. And when it comes to spirituality, fear can create distance, it can create judgment, it can create division within communities, but awareness does the opposite. Awareness brings clarity, it brings understanding, it allows people to explore without fear. Now, this is not about telling people what to believe. Everyone's spiritual path is personal, everyone connects in different ways, but it is important to understand history, context, and how narratives are formed. Because once you understand that, you can make choices from a place of knowledge instead of fear. Spirituality should not feel like control, it should feel like connection, it should feel like grounding, it should feel like growth. And if something makes you feel disconnected from yourself, it's worth questioning, not rejecting blindly, but questioning, because true understanding requires curiosity, and curiosity leads to clarity. At the end of the day, this conversation is about reclaiming awareness, about recognizing that history is layered, that narratives are shaped, and that understanding where those narratives come from allows you to decide what resonates with you, not out of fear, not out of pressure, but out of understanding. Because when you understand, you move differently, and that's where real power is. And I want to go even deeper into this because there's more to it that we have to really understand. This wasn't just about religion, this was about control. Because if I can control what you believe, I can control how you think. And if I can control how you think, I can control how you move. Back then, enslaved people weren't just physically controlled, they were mentally and spiritually controlled. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to separate people from their roots, from their ancestors, from their identity, from the systems that gave them strength. Because hoodoo and voodoo were not just spiritual practices, they were survival systems. They were how people stayed connected, they were how people healed, they were how people protected themselves, they were how people resisted. So, from the perspective of those in power, that's dangerous. Because a connected people is a powerful people. A people who know who they are, who they come from, and what they're capable of, that's not easy to control. So, what do? You don't always remove it completely. You make them afraid of it. You label it evil. You label it dangerous. You label it forbidden. And once fear is attached to something, people start to distance themselves from it, even if it originally belonged to them. That's how you conquer and divide someone from themselves. And once that disconnection happens, you can start replacing their identity with something else, something easier to control, something that doesn't require them to look within, something that keeps authority outside of themselves instead of within. Because if your power is always outside of you, you'll always feel like you need permission. And that's where fear becomes a weapon. Fear keeps people from questioning. Fear keeps people from exploring. Fear keeps people from remembering. And over time, that fear becomes normalized. People start repeating things they were told without asking why. They start judging things they don't understand. They start rejecting parts of themselves without even realizing it. And that's how mental conditioning works. Now, at the same time, we have to be honest about something else. Even though certain practices were demonized, elements of those same practices still exist in other accepted systems today. Using water for cleansing, whether you call it spiritual baths or holy water, it's still working with the element of water. Using oils, whether you call it anointing or ritual, it's still working with intention and energy. Burning incense like frankincense and myrrh, it's still about cleansing, purification, and creating a certain atmosphere. These practices didn't just appear out of nowhere, they existed across cultures, especially in African traditions, long before they were restructured and renamed. And that's why it's important to look beyond labels, because sometimes what people reject under one name, they accept under another. And that's where the half truth comes in. People are taught just enough to follow, but not enough to understand. So instead of exploring, they stay within what feels safe, even if that safety is based on fear rather than truth. And again, this is not about telling anyone what to believe, but it is about recognizing patterns, patterns of demonization, patterns of control, patterns of rewriting narratives, patterns of taking from something, renaming it, and then distancing people from the original source. We've seen this pattern not just in spirituality, but in culture, history, music, language, everything. Take it, repackage it, profit from it, distance the original people from it. Same pattern. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. That's why awareness is so important because once you become aware, you stop operating from fear. You stop rejecting things just because you were told to. You start asking questions. You start looking deeper. You start thinking for yourself. And that's where real freedom begins, not just physical freedom, but mental freedom, because you can be physically free and still mentally controlled. But when you start questioning, when you start learning, when you start reconnecting with yourself, something shifts. You don't move the same anymore. You don't judge the same anymore. You don't fear the same things anymore. You become more grounded in your own understanding, and that's the key. This isn't about replacing one belief system with another. This is about understanding, understanding where things come from, understanding how narratives are created, understanding how fear is used, understanding how people are conditioned. Because once you understand, you can choose, not from fear, not from pressure, but from awareness. And that's how you break cycles, because cycles continue when people don't question them. But the moment you start asking, why was this demonized? Who benefits from me being afraid of this? What was the original purpose of this? That's when the cycle starts to crack. And once it cracks, it can't fully hold you anymore. And now we have to really talk about what hoodoo and voodoo actually are and what they are not, because a lot of people have strong opinions about these systems without ever truly understanding them. First, let's be clear about this. Your ancestors are not demons. That idea alone shows you how deep the conditioning goes. Because how did we get to a place where honoring your ancestors, your bloodline, your lineage, your people is seen as something dark or evil? That didn't come from us, that was taught. Hoodoo is not just about voodoo dolls. That's one of the biggest myths that was pushed to scare people. When most people hear the word voodoo, they immediately think of harm, curses, dolls, and darkness. But that's not the full picture. That's the version that was marketed. Hoodoo traditionally is about healing, it's about protection, it's about guidance, it's about connection, it's about working with your ancestors, working with nature, working with herbs, roots, prayers, intention, things that help you stay grounded, protected, and aligned. Now, let's be honest about something. Just like anything else in this world, there are people who misuse it. There are people who come into these systems with bad intentions. People who want to harm, manipulate, or control. And yes, some of those people may use things like dolls or rituals in harmful ways, but that does not make the system itself evil. That speaks to the person, because good and bad exist in everything. You can take something meant for healing and use it for harm. That doesn't change its original purpose, it just shows the intention of the person using it. And that's important to understand, because if we start labeling entire systems as evil based on how some people misuse them, then we would have to do that across the board for everything. The truth is, traditionally, hoodoo has always been used for survival, healing, and liberation. It was created and shaped by enslaved Africans in a time of extreme oppression. When people were stripped of everything, freedom, identity, language, they still found ways to hold on to something. They used what they had. They used the land. They used herbs. They used prayer. They used ancestral connection. Hoodoo became a way to protect themselves, to heal themselves, and in some cases to spiritually resist the conditions they were under. It wasn't about harming randomly, it was about survival. And that's a big difference. Vodou, on the other hand, is a structured spiritual system with its own beliefs, deities, and practices. Hoodoo is more of a folk practice, something that evolved through experience, adaptation, and necessity, but both of them have been heavily misunderstood and misrepresented, and that's where propaganda comes in. Hollywood played a huge role in this. Movies, shows, and media constantly portrayed these practices as dark, dangerous, and evil. They showed extreme versions, curses, dolls, chaos, but never showed the healing, the protection, the cultural depth behind it, because fear sells, but also fear controls. If you can make people afraid of something, they won't go near it, they won't question it, they won't explore it, they'll just reject it automatically. And if that something is connected to their roots, their ancestors, and their identity, then you've successfully disconnected them from themselves. That's the real impact. Now let's break down a few myths and truths. The myth is that hoodoo, and vodou are about harming people. The truth is, at their core, they are about connection, protection, and balance. The myth is that working with ancestors is dangerous. The truth is, honoring your ancestors is about remembering where you come from, gaining guidance, and staying rooted in your lineage. The myth is that these systems are dark. The truth is, they were labeled that way to make people fear them. The myth is that it's all about rituals and objects. The truth is, it's about intention, energy, and relationship with yourself, your ancestors, and the world around you. And again, yes, there are people who misuse these systems, but misuse exists everywhere. There are people who misuse religion, people who misuse power, people who misuse knowledge. That doesn't define the original purpose. It defines the person. So when you hear about hoodoo or vodou, instead of reacting from fear, it's important to ask, where did this information come from? Who taught me this? What was the original purpose of these practices? Because a lot of what we've been told is incomplete, and incomplete information leads to misunderstanding. Understanding doesn't mean you have to practice something, but it does mean you're no longer controlled by fear of it. And that's the difference, because at the end of the day, this is about awareness. It's about recognizing how narratives are shaped, how fear is used, and how people are disconnected from their roots. And once you see that clearly, you can start thinking for yourself, not based on propaganda, not based on fear, but based on understanding. And that's where true empowerment begins. And to go even deeper into this, hoodoo at its core is about healing, it's about liberation, it's about unity, it's about restoring what was broken. Hoodoo is not just something you do, it's something you live. It's a way of reconnecting to yourself, your lineage, and your purpose. It's about healing the people, starting with yourself, and then extending that healing outward. Because healing is not just individual, it's generational. A lot of us are carrying things that didn't start with us, patterns, trauma, beliefs, cycles that were passed down through our bloodline. And hoodoo, in its true essence, is about breaking those cycles, breaking generational curses, breaking generational patterns, breaking things that have been repeating for years, even centuries. And when we say generational curses, we're not just talking about something mystical or dramatic. We're talking about real patterns, cycles of poverty, cycles of pain, cycles of broken relationships, cycles of self doubt and disconnection. Hoodoo is about identifying those patterns and intentionally working to shift them. That's where the healing comes in, through prayer, through intention, through working with herbs, roots, and natural elements, through connecting with your ancestors, not in fear, but in respect, because your ancestors are not just your past. They are your foundation, and many of them struggled. Many of them endured things we can't even imagine: oppression, displacement, loss, survival under conditions that were never meant for them. So, when you do this work, you're not just healing yourself, you're healing your lineage. You're bringing peace where there was pain. You're bringing clarity where there was confusion. You're bringing strength where there was struggle. And that's powerful because a healed lineage creates a different future. Now, let's talk about elevation. Hoodoo is also about growth, about evolving, about becoming more aware, more grounded, more aligned. It's not about staying stuck, it's about rising, it's about stepping into your higher self. In some traditions, people refer to this as your ori, your inner consciousness, your higher awareness, your true self. The part of you that knows, that sees, that guides you when everything else feels unclear. Connecting with your ori is about alignment. It's about listening to your intuition, trusting your inner voice, moving with intention instead of reaction. And when you combine that with ancestral connection, you're not moving blindly anymore. You're supported, you're guided, you're aware. That's how you become elevated, not by trying to be above others, but by becoming more in tune with yourself, more disciplined, more intentional, more aware of your actions, your thoughts, your energy. That's real mastery. Hoodoo is not about control over others, it's about control over self. It's about mastering your mind, your habits, your patterns, your responses. It's about becoming someone who is grounded, protected, and aligned. And when you are aligned, your life moves differently. You make better decisions. You see things more clearly. You attract differently. You move with purpose. That's elevation. And again, this is not about perfection. It's about progress. It's about doing the work, looking at yourself honestly, facing what needs to be healed, and choosing to grow anyway, because growth requires intention, and Hoodoo at its core is intentional living. It's about not just letting life happen to you, but actively participating in your own healing, your own development, your own evolution. It's about reclaiming your power, not in a way that harms others, but in a way that restores yourself. And when enough people start doing that, when enough people start healing, breaking cycles, reconnecting with themselves, that's when you see real change. That's when communities begin to shift. That's when unity becomes possible because healed people move differently. They don't operate from constant fear. They don't operate from constant reaction. They don't operate from constant division. They move with awareness. And that's what this is really about. Not fear, not control, not misinformation, but healing, liberation, growth, and becoming who you were always meant to be. And now we have to talk about the ancestors, because this is where a lot of the misunderstanding and honestly the fear comes from. Ancestral veneration was not always seen as something strange or negative. It was natural, it was normal, it was a part of everyday life. People honored those who came before them, they learned from them, they stayed connected to them. So the question becomes, why was that demonized? Why were we taught to fear our own ancestors? Because again, this goes back to control. If I can separate you from your ancestors, I can separate you from your identity. If I can make you afraid of your lineage, I can make you reject the very thing that holds your history, your knowledge, and your foundation, because your ancestors are not just people from the past. They are your bloodline, they are your memory, they are part of you. And when you understand that, when you truly understand that, you move differently because your ancestors carried knowledge. They carried practices, they carried wisdom that was built over generations, things about survival, things about healing, things about community, things about self. And a lot of that knowledge is not taught in modern systems. So if you can keep people disconnected from that, you can keep them dependent on what you give them instead. That's why ancestral practices were labeled as dangerous, evil, or forbidden, not because they were harmful, but because they were empowering. Because when you connect with your roots, you start to remember things about yourself that you were never taught. You start to see yourself differently. You start to question what you've been told. And that kind of awareness is not easy to control. So instead of allowing that connection, fear was introduced. People were told that their ancestors were something to be afraid of, that connecting to them was wrong, that honoring them was dangerous. And over time, that fear became normalized. People started rejecting their own lineage without even understanding why. That's how deep conditioning works. And at the same time, history was simplified and in many cases minimized. Many of us were taught that our story begins and ends with slavery, that our ancestors were only victims, that their entire existence was defined by oppression. But that's not the full story. Our ancestors were more than what they went through. They were leaders, they were builders, they were thinkers, they were fighters, they were survivors. They resisted in different ways, in different forms, under conditions that were meant to break them. And yes, there was pain. Yes, there was suffering, but there was also strength. There was strategy. There was resilience. And that part of the story is often not emphasized, because when you only teach a people about their suffering and not their strength, it shapes how they see themselves. It limits their identity. It keeps them disconnected from their full history. Now, again, this is not about replacing one narrative with another extreme. It's about recognizing that history is layered. And when parts of that history are left out, it creates an incomplete picture. When ancestral connection is discouraged, it creates distance from identity. And when identity is unclear, people are easier to influence. That's why this conversation matters. Because reconnecting, whether that looks like learning about your family history Honoring those who came before you, or simply reflecting on where you come from, is not about going backward. It's about understanding your foundation. It's about grounding yourself. It's about knowing that your story did not start with limitation. And when you understand that, it changes how you see yourself. It changes how you move. It changes what you believe is possible, not because of fear, but because of awareness. And awareness leads to clarity. Clarity leads to confidence, and confidence changes everything. This is the Black Gods Podcast.